Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here, and I'm joined by Barna's Brooke Hempell. Welcome, Brooke.
Thanks. Good to see you, Carey.
Hey, it's good to see you. We are going to be joined in a few moments by Raymond Chang from Wheaton College as we talk about, justice and Asian Americans. And obviously, our world has been turned upside down again. And Barna has a great big study we'll be talking about called Beyond Diversity. And I know you've got some data to share with us, and I'd love to get a little bit of a preview about that because that's coming out at the end of April. So
Right.
tell us, what have you found today that you want to share from the data, Brooke?
Yeah, we're launching it next week. So two things I wanted to mention. One is it's really interesting to see kind of the patterns of people's perceptions and experiences in our data set. We've pretty consistently seen when it comes to kind of awareness and involvement in issues around race in the US, that we have this interesting spread where we'll have maybe white Christians on one end kind of having some minimal agreement or involvement with some of these issues, and then African American Christians on the further end being much more concerned about these issues, more engaged with them. And then there's a mix in the middle. But we do find that a lot of the Asian American Christians in our data sets look a bit more like the white Christians in terms of their kind of awareness and agreement with some of these issues, and their engagement or motivation to get engaged. And what's interesting is I think we have watched unfold over the past year where maybe some of these issues were personal experiences of their own, but they didn't really talk about them or engage in them very collectively up until recently. Because of COVID, there's just been a lot more engagement with this topic and realization that this is something the community needs to come together around and talk more openly about. So we have seen a little bit of a shift where one of our data points is looking at a question that says historically the U.S. has been oppressive to minorities. We only had about 40% of white Christians and also Asian American Christians agreeing with that statement. Whereas you'd have 75% of African American Christians that would agree with that statement. So there's a really big difference in there. But we're also seeing that engagement is changing in the moment, that we're starting to see more responsiveness around this topic.
Wow. Okay, that's good to know. That's a bit surprising, actually. I wasn't expecting that. Anything else you want to share? I think you had a couple of data points, Brooke, that you're going to walk us through.
Yeah. So the other one was about what do you think people should do to improve race dynamics in our country? And this one was really interesting because uniformly across the board, approximately 8 out of 10 practicing Christians says, first of all, we need to worship together. We need to welcome people of all races and ethnicities into our worship environments and do that together, that builds understanding and empathy. But then we start to see some nuances. And in this particular case, the second thing mentioned by specifically Asian American Christians that's higher than any other group is that we need to teach how the Bible encourages us to pay attention to marginalized groups and encourages special kindness to them, or mercy, basically. So that's really how that's 50% of Asian American Christians say that, compared to only 34% of white Christians. So it's really a priority for them. And how do we think our churches ought to be addressing this? It's like, what does Scripture say about these topics?
That is good to know. And tell us a little bit about Beyond Diversity. What does that title even mean? Like Beyond Diversity?
Right. So we started the study looking at multi-ethnic churches and wanting to understand what perceptions of and experiences of racism or racial justice issues were in these environments. And as we waded into the research, we realized actually this study is so much more about diversity. This is not just about statistical diversity or proximity to people of color. This is actually about having a deeper understanding of how these issues are playing out in our country, and having a better understanding of what Scripture is telling us to do and how to think about these topics and engage in them lovingly in today's society. And so it moved beyond that into really more topics of racial justice. So as we conducted the study, we realized that this is not about the multi-ethnic church. This is about everyone. This is about understanding racial justice in our country, and especially how we as Christians ought to live.
Well, I imagine too, there's a lot of leaders listening church leaders who would say, I need something for my board, for my staff to look at? Would it be that kind of report?
Definitely. I mean, it's geared towards church leaders. And
Right.
I would say maybe the church leaders who are already interested, maybe they already have a desire to have a diverse church and they're trying to do that in a way that's healthy. And so this gives a lot of steps. It takes it, from a basic awareness and knowledge level to the next step of what do we think is the right way to approach this as a church, a healthy way to build good, diverse community.
Well, I wonder if it's one of those things too, because we have looked at that data where I think there are probably some pastors who would like, look, I would love to address this, but it's too divisive in my church. And maybe this could be a bridge. So
Yeah.
people can get it at barna.com/beyond diversity, correct?
Correct.
And is it available for pre-order? You don't have to wait for release?
Yes, that's correct. People can order it now. It
Okay.
releases next week, and then the print copies will come later. We're doing a webinar next week where we're sharing some of the insights and applications with some church leaders. So that'll be a really great deep dive into it.
Great. And because we love our podcast listeners, if you use the promo code ChurchPulse15, you will get a discount. Well, Brooke, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So yeah, let's invite Raymond Chang in. He is the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. He is a writer. He speaks regularly throughout America on issues pertaining to Christianity and culture, race and faith. And he currently lives in Chicago and serves as the campus minister at Wheaton College. Welcome, Ray.
Thanks so much, Carey. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So um, I think the events in Atlanta were a real shock and a bit of a wake-up call. And you've been on a plane regularly to and from Atlanta over the last month or so. But racism predates the events in Atlanta. It predates COVID. It goes back hundreds of years. Can we start by you just giving us a bit of a historic perspective on racism from an Asian American perspective in America?
Yeah, I mean, when you say that racism has affected Asian Americans or Asians in America for a long time, that's absolutely true. I think it's never been easy to enter into the United States as an Asian American, and you see that from the beginning of time, really. You as as early as 150 years ago, some of the things that you quickly see is that as soon as Asians started getting a foothold in the United States, in society, economically, in whatever ways, in the community, one of the things that you find is that that it quickly became a threat to the status quo, and
Hmm.
so taxes would be imposed on them. Different fees would be added to the businesses that they were conducting, including like laundry businesses or laundry delivery businesses. And then significant amounts of discrimination, prejudice, and even violence were imposed upon Asians. Um, Throughout history, Asians have always been considered yellow peril, and
Hmm.
so easy scapegoats for many to consider. And so whenever it was convenient for people to blame Asians, like we're seeing during this pandemic, people would blame them, and they would kind of draw from longstanding stereotypes that Asians are filthy or dirty, that their food is viewed as the food is gross, that our customs and traditions and practices are exotic, and the ways in which we have been viewed as Oriental or a spectacle that was never really going to be a part of the mainstream has been a part of kind of like our existence, whether we liked it or not. And so we've constantly been scapegoated throughout history. I mean, to the point where the largest single lynching in the United States took place against Asian Americans in 1871. And then we've seen the ways that we've had to choose throughout history between invisibility and exclusion. And so, in 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically banned Asians and banned initially the Chinese and then the majority of Asia through the Asiatic Barred Zone from entering into the United States for nearly 80 years. And it was because of the work of the civil rights movement that some of those immigration laws changed, and that in 1965 the Immigration Act was released, and that allowed Asians to re-enter back into the United States. Some
So for
even
80 years, Asians were banned from the US.
yeah. So you have to wonder like how like our population is currently a little over 5%. We're the fastest growing population in the United States. And one of the things that you wonder is, what would our population look like if we weren't banned for 80 years? Maybe we would have been 20% of the population, and that would have been an extremely different experience for many Asian Americans who grew up as the only Asian American in their school, or as the only person in their communities. And now we're seeing that the largest that most of the diversity in the United States is actually not by immigration, but primarily through birth rates. And so we're seeing the growth happen there as well. But yeah, for 80 years we were excluded.
Okay, pardon my ignorance. What happened with the mass lynching? That is news to me.
Yeah, so in 1871 in Los Angeles, and when the population was very small, about 10% of the white population in LA descended upon 10% of the Asian population, and wiped out 10% of the Asian population, which was somewhere between 17 and 21 people. And so it was a small community, but if 10% of your community, like, so think about, like, if all your family members got together and 10% were just wiped out and lynched, where people, fingers were being cut off, people were being executed and hung, simply because they were perceived as a threat. What might happen to your family or to your community, how that kind of would have lingering effects. Well, that happened to the Chinese in Los Angeles, and if you go to Chinatown now, there are memorials there where it shows kind of where you can kind of visit the locations that it happened. But it was the single largest lynching in the United States, according to many historians. And obviously, we weren't lynched at the same rate as African Americans were, but this became a model in many ways for what many African Americans started to experience. And so they saw what happened to Asians and say, this is a way to exterminate those who are considered to be a problem, a racial problem. And so that led to a lot of the executions and the lynchings of African Americans.
Oh my goodness. I didn't know that. And not looking obviously for justification, but what was the rationale behind the exclusion for 80 years? What was the thinking at the time behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, there were multiple reasons, but ultimately, what it comes down to is that that Chinese people were viewed as taking jobs, that they were establishing a foothold in society, that they were taking away resources, which is very similar to the rhetoric we hear today on immigration. That they were taking up to, essentially, it was when people felt like Asians were taking up too much space, and when the Chinese people were taking up too much space, they started searching for ways to get rid of them. And so the Page Act, which preceded the Exclusion Act of 1882, banned Chinese women from entering because it was a way of controlling the population. If Chinese women didn't come, then they wouldn't marry, they wouldn't have families, and the population wouldn't expand. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act occurred, and then for 80 years that prevented Asians from entering into the States.
Wow. Okay, I did not know that. When when Brooke shared the data, which I thought was really interesting, did it surprise you that Asian Americans largely paralleled white Americans until recently in their attitudes? That was news to me as well.
Is it Asian Americans or Asian American Christians? I thought it was
Asian American Christians. Thanks for the distinction.
Okay. Yeah. So that doesn't surprise me because that's consistent with other research that's been done. And I'm really grateful that Brooke brought that out. There's actually more and more research that's showing similar trends. And a part of that is because I would say a lot of Asians, especially East Asians, tend to be more evangelical. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more of is that, as much as evangelicalism is a theological conviction and commitment and a movement, it's sadly become much more of a politicized and political movement, and we saw that with the rise of the moral majority, with kind of the marriage between kind of partisan politics and Christianity or evangelicalism, which is wreaking havoc on the church today. And I'm sure that we can talk about that more as time goes on. But with Asian Americans, especially East Asians, because Filipinos are primarily and significantly Catholic, and other Asian ethnic groups, which there are over Asian Americans are over 40 ethnicities are represented, with countless languages, numerous customs and practices and histories. And so with a lot of East Asians especially, what you see is that evangelicalism is a part of our kind of like Christian DNA. And a part of that is because our influences in a lot of ways have been evangelical. And so so Asian American Christians, especially East Asian American Christians, have really bought into the evangelical playbook, which has led to people viewing things in ways that are consistent with white evangelicals, even though the broader Asian American community tends to swing in different ways. And so, yeah, what we're hearing, what we heard from Brooke is pretty consistent with what's actually happening.
Okay. So obviously things changed a lot like recently with the Atlanta shootings, the murders. Um, with everything happening over this last year and the last few months in particular with Asian Americans, how has that left you feeling? And what, I mean, you've been constantly in the public forum, trying to raise awareness. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the impact on you and your community?
Yeah, I mean, even as you asked that, it just reminds me how tired I am. I'm
Yeah.
personally I'm very weary. I'm exhausted in ways that I really haven't been ever in my life. I think what this season has provoked in me is a deeper and visceral understanding of what I believe African Americans face in this country,
Mm,
and in a lot of ways what kind of native populations or indigenous populations face in this country, who don't have as much of a political voice or have as many resources that they can draw from, due to a lot of systemic challenges that they face. And so that's why a lot of the indigenous realities are oftentimes invisible to the rest of kind of the American landscape. But I I think with what was happening since the beginning of last year, like intellectually, I had known what African Americans faced.
mm,
Emotionally, I don't know how deeply I felt it, but it started last year because I had commitment. I committed to racial justice. I was committed to, to seeing the liberation of my brothers and sisters who were being penalized just for having black skin. And I knew that I had experienced anti-Asian sentiments and racism growing up, but I didn't. I always kind of had enough energy to continue to muster through it, and then also stand in solidarity with African Americans and stand in unity with them. But this season has been so exhausting that um, I can see more clearly, not maybe not to the fullest extent of what African Americans go through, and it just pains me
mm.
because I feel like I'm for the last month I've been on the brink of tears. I know that after Atlanta happened, I cried every day for 5 days straight. I couldn't hold it back, and then especially as I'm navigating these things with my family, with friends, with my students at Wheaton College, um, and then people who are part of the Asian American Christian Collaborative community. I I feel like I've been walking beyond with a kind of like a burden of beyond exhaustion, and I think it's sad. What's really sad about racism is that it adds a burden to an already exhausting existence that some people have to carry while others don't. And the privilege of not having to care and to be able to step away has been something that I have been really wrestling with a lot, and realizing that there are some populations that just can't because it happens so much to them.
Hmm. Well, I'm so sorry, and thank you so much for sharing that. I talked to another Asian American leader on a different show, and I asked him about the events, and he just, he'd had a very successful life in America, and he just said, the last year in particular, and the last few months, he said, it feels different when all of a sudden it's you. And that just really lodged in my mind, because obviously as a Caucasian male, I'm not sure we know that feeling in the same way. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think with Atlanta, it really affected Asian women, Asian American women in ways that I don't think most people realize. And I've never seen kind of the entire country, or the entire Asian American female population react with the exact same things. in the exact same way. I mean, it was reeling because,
What did you see? What did you see?
yeah, I mean, I think my wife Jessica, she said it perfectly. It was the first time that she felt like Asian Americans, and more specifically Asian American women, felt like that they were kind of allowed to feel sad and angry and be public about it. Because a lot of times, many Asian American women feel like they can't bring their full selves into the picture, and they can't talk about the things that are weighing on their hearts, and that they can't kind of disclose their pains because of the ways in which they're both kind of racialized as well as gendered in very unhealthy ways. And just seeing the fact that so many people said, I don't even know what I need right now.
Mm.
Um, and that even if something was like offered as like a space, I don't know if I would want to enter into it. Um, and then trying to process through that on their own, as well as in community with other people, and seeing how, um, even with the support, that it just felt like it wasn't enough. Um, you know, times of turning in prayer to God, weeping, lamenting, asking God to intervene, and feeling like there was just this stark emptiness. I think it was pretty shocking, and I heard that all throughout the country.
So one of the things that made the Atlanta shootings so troubling, perplexing, confusing, disturbing is that the shooter grew up in a Southern Baptist church, right? Part of the youth group. And I realize being part of a church is no guarantee of anything, but I'd love your comment on the dynamics of that. And then, well, we'll leave it there. Just any comments on the dynamic of that, Raymond?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially within the Western church, one of the things that we've done a great job on is focusing on personal piety and personal holiness. Obviously, that has come with its own set of issues, as people who are dealing with deep-seated addictions or deep-seated shame don't know how to bring that forward, because there seems to be this kind of expectation of perfection in a lot of churches,
Hmm.
with the emphasis on personal piety and holiness. But that has been one area in which kind of the Western kind of church has really kind of staked its claim. What it's done poorly is to help people navigate the broader social questions and societal concerns that are impacting the church and shaping the people within the church, to the point where, the fact that we can't talk about certain issues, or that people haven't ever talked about certain issues until they, watch it on TV or go to college or see it on the news or read a book on it, and that the church doesn't know how to address it because it's so severely ill-equipped, means that we're not actively able to disciple people in the way that they're supposed to be discipled, right? I mean, we have a personal discipleship where, our integrity matters. Our discipleship is also relational, but it's also social and societal. We are bearers of God's image, ambassadors for Christ, in the world. And so what we do in the world and how we navigate with the world and how we interact with the world has a kind of kingdom implications. Unfortunately, too many churches have become country clubs for its own members, instead of field hospitals where people who are truly hurting from the outside can find solace and comfort. And I think that, we do a good job to some degree, if like there's like kind of interpersonal connections of bringing people in. But we've taken so much of a come and see approach instead of a go and seek approach, that I don't think that people know how to live in this world that we actually live in, answering the big questions that people are asking, and seeing how the message of Jesus, the gospel of Christ, actually applies to some of the most significant issues of our day. And so people so we're leaving discipleship on these major issues up to the world, and any issue that we are not addressing within the church is kind of being kind of co-opted by the broader society. And I think in part that's kind of what we saw with the shooter in Atlanta, that there were probably things that he didn't have the ability to navigate, and that that his church probably took the playbook that they were given to address certain sins and certain issues. And clearly, like, not everyone is going to be kind of caught in the process, and like and not, the church is not going to have a perfect response to everything, but some of the things that he was saying were deeply kind of consistent with kind of the Western Christian kind of ethos, um which was what was hard, I think, for me to hear.
What specific things that he was saying would be consistent with that?
I mean, so things, and I'd have to look back because I don't remember everything that he
No,
was
no, I
saying.
mean, even generally, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, about like the statements that he was making around uh things that were consistent with like the notion of purity culture. Don't get me wrong, God calls us to pursue purity, but there is a purity culture that almost condemns anyone that even has a has a negative or even sinful thought, and it doesn't leave space for people to actually process through it, and it tends to blame women for the lack of purity within kind of the male imagination. And I don't think that any of that is really healthy, right?
No, it's
Yes,
pretty
God
twisted.
has,
Yeah.
excuse me?
I said that's pretty twisted. Yeah.
And so, I mean, like, yes, God calls us to kind of live by, his will, and calls us into obedience to him, but not in a way that shirks responsibility and neglects kind of some of the dynamics that are actually at play.
Yeah. What would you say to youth pastors and senior pastors who are asking the question, and I'm not blaming the church at all, but like, what if I have someone like that in my youth group? Like, what am I doing that contributes to that? Knowing that everybody is responsible for their own actions, yet there is a systemic or a theological vibe we give off that sometimes produces intended consequences and sometimes unintended consequences.
Yeah, I mean, sin loves to wreak havoc.
Yeah.
Satan loves to destroy, and steal, kill, and destroy wherever he can. Um, I think it's healthy to assume that people are like that, or people who have that propensity are within our midst, and to say, okay, how can we disciple people out of that? But for kind of the youth pastor, or for the pastor who's wondering that, I don't think that we should operate with fear. I think we should operate with a soberness that allows us to engage with the difficult realities and actually engage with those things, right? So don't avoid the hard topics. See what the scriptures say, see what Christian tradition has to say, learn from the global church, and examine the ways in which Jesus is calling people to live, and how that impacts our pastoring and our shepherding as well. But I don't think that unless people feel like it's a place where they feel safe to be a sinner, or they feel safe to ask questions, or feel like there are places in which they can safely ask and address difficult topics, that we're never going to get to the root of it, right? And so there has to be kind of like a commitment to cultivating brave spaces where challenging topics can be addressed in godly and loving ways, that are filled with grace, but are also kind of willing to could get into the mess of things and say, you know what, we're imperfect people gathered together under the love and the sovereignty of God, and we know that the message that Jesus has an answer to all things. And so, what is that answer, and how does He want to lead us in and through these things?
Well, drilling down on that a little bit, you are the director, president, founder of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and you've been advising churches on how to engage in dialogue. So I want to imagine just a little bit more, if there's anything more on that. Let's say you're advising a largely Caucasian church, one that isn't very racially diverse, one that potentially does produce attitudes like we saw, or harbors people with attitudes like we saw among the Atlanta shooter. What would you say what would you advise those church leaders to do to change the dialogue, to change the tone and temperature in their church?
Yeah, several things. That's a great question. And like I'm regularly in contact with not just Asian American pastors, but pastors from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds. One of the things I tell people is that pulpits proclaim priorities. That pulpits will let people know what is important and what's not important. The things that
Hmm.
you speak on and the things that you avoid speaking on
Like
kind of
silence as well. Yeah.
silence speaks a lot. So, like some people talk about the deafening silence of the church on issues of on matters of racial justice all the time. Like like where does the church really stand? How does the church really navigate this? And they don't know. And so I think there's that, prayers do the same thing. Public prayers do the same thing. But I do think that because kind of like the predominantly white church in the United States has avoided discussions around issues of race, and people have to understand that people are racialized differently. Like whites are racialized in a particular way, African Americans are racialized in a particular way, Asians are racialized in a particular way, Latinos are racialized in a different way, and we're all different. We're racialized in ways that we have to understand how that affects our own communities, but how that also kind of impacts the ways in which we navigate other communities.
Can you explain what you mean by how whites are racialized?
Yes. So everyone is racialized. So
Okay.
to think that kind of America is kind of one way along issues of race, to say that my way is the normative way or the dominant way, or it should be the standard way, is one of the ways in which people are racialized. And the way that most whites are racialized is to think that race isn't as big of a problem as it really is. Right?
Gotcha.
Asians are actually being racialized in the same way, which is why the Barna study kind of revealed the things that they revealed, because historically we've always been used as the model minority. We've been labeled as the model minority, and most people think isn't that a good thing to be a model minority? Like like you're the model of a minority population in the United States where everyone should be like you. Well, what most people don't see is that the model minority myth, it's first of all, it's a myth. It's not actually true, even though that there are some Asian Americans that have succeeded wildly. Among the Asian American population, there's the largest wealth and income gap among all the racial populations,
Did not know
right?
that.
So yeah,
Wow.
so and a part of on the one hand, we're racialized to be invisible in the kind of broader framework. So not a lot of people know what Asian Americans experience, but the model minority myth is particularly kind of troublesome because it's not about celebrating what Asian Americans can contribute and bring. In fact, it actually does the opposite. It celebrates that Asian Americans don't, quote unquote, want to be a first class citizen. They don't rock the boat. They don't challenge the status quo. That they succeed because they keep their heads down, and that Black and brown minority populations should actually try to be more like Asian Americans. And Asian Americans are often used as a wedge to say, look, if you just put your head down, don't complain, study hard, work hard, you will succeed, and you won't be treated as a second class citizen, which we're seeing that is not true based on what we're seeing in the pandemic. It's actually, we've been actually used to push other communities down and keep other communities down.
Oh, wow. That's a very clarifying perspective. Thank you. You did contribute to the Beyond Diversity study. Do you want to tell me sort of your takeaway from that and maybe a little bit about your contribution, Raymond?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably wrote a little bit about the history of Asian Americans, and so some of the things that we probably discussed today are
Yeah.
probably that.
Yeah.
And then I think it's important work that that the Barna Group is doing. I really appreciated their production of this, and I'm looking for. I haven't seen it personally myself, so I'm looking
Haha.
forward
You
to
know
it.
your little piece. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, so you've been very let's deal with one more controversial subject, because why not, right? So you've been involved with advocacy, protests, justice marches, et cetera, et cetera. People have different levels of comfort with that. Can you speak as to why that is important in your life and why you think it's important for Christians?
Yeah, I mean, I think even if you asked me, 5 years ago, like, would you ever go to a protest? I would have probably said, I don't know. I don't know if it's safe, or I don't know X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Um, like I was active about talking about race and justice within the church, but not necessarily out in the public square. And so what I realized was that the church in the public square, that the church is a part of the public square. And even during, so Adam Toledo was killed, a 13-year-old boy in the Chicago area. And so I went to this kind of this walk that was put on by a variety of organizations, including including a partnership with some faith organizations in the little village area of Chicago. And one of the things I realized was that it was not a Christian organization, it was not a Christian march, it was not a Christian event, but because the church in the area was active within the community, a local church pastor was invited to give a prayer
Hmm.
at this non-Christian event. And that moved me because I realized that so many churches would not be invited to participate in something like this. And it said that we're so insular that the broader kind of community, even our own neighborhood around us, doesn't see us as like a participating member of the community.
Hmm.
Like the stuff that we've done with the Asian American Christian Collaborative, we hosted a march in Chicago. It was a prayer march that went from a historic Asian American Christian church to a historic African American Christian church, the Chinese Christian Union Church, which is over 100 years old, to a Progressive Baptist Church, which is over 100 years old. And we had somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people show up, with over 100 churches represented.
Wow.
The majority of them were Asian Americans, and we marched for Black lives and dignity. Right. And so these are people that likely would have never gone to a march, never gone to a protest in either direction. But because it was led by Christians and by the church, they decided that they were going to come out. The most consistent response I heard from people who never had participated in a protest or a march or anything like that was, this was probably one of the most spiritually formative and spiritually impactful things I've ever done, because it put feet to my faith. It told me to take the gospel that I believe into the world, and to stand with other people and to march with other people to declare that the image of God is sacred and precious, that we're not just saying it in our private chats, in our private conversations, but we're telling the whole world that we care. This is what the same thing happened with Atlanta, post Atlanta, like a couple weeks later, we hosted a rally that took place in 14 different cities, a simultaneous rally across the country that again took place at the same time, which is what simultaneous means, in conjunction with the Atlanta rally, which I was at, where Asian American Christians and friends of our communities gathered together. Most of them were led by Asian American women, or I think all of them had featured prominently Asian American women, Asian American Christian women. And the whole country, throughout 14 cities, people just prayed together and they worshiped together. And it was another time, like it was the first time that many people went out and said, I did not know that faith and activism could go hand in hand. That I always thought that faith was just something in my heart, and then something, nice things that I do with the church from time to time, but not anything beyond that. And they're saying that this was probably one of the most impactful things that they've ever seen or experienced. And so,
Any final thoughts to leave with us, Raymond?
Oh, many. Is there
Yeah,
anything
I know.
helpful to clarify? Yeah, I think when it comes to discipleship, I would love to see a more holistic discipleship that isn't afraid to enter into the messiness of the world. Obviously, you want to do that with people that are kind of willing to journey with you and to extend grace to you and to kind of commit to long-term partnerships with you. But a whole life discipleship is something that I've seen, especially younger people craving. They're asking the question, what does my faith mean for the world? What does my faith implicate me for? And what does Jesus have to do with justice? And over and over, the things that I'm hearing from like my students who are part of Gen Z.
Yeah, let's talk about that, Gen Z, and where, because you work with them every day. So give us a snapshot.
Yeah, they want to see the church engaged on big discussions and big topics. They are constantly asking why the church isn't engaged on this stuff. Why do they only care about the wealthiest people in the church who might uh, pull their giving from the church if they start talking about certain issues? And they're not even asking the church to change their theological position, but they're asking people to disciple them, to say, how do I actually navigate this as a Christian? Because here's what the world is telling me, and I just don't know what Jesus is telling me. And they're processing through it, and they're talking to themselves, and they're coming up with their own solutions, and they're very smart and they're very wise. But one of the things I think that they're grieving about and lamenting is that the church is so ill-equipped to navigate these things, and so they're oftentimes feeling like they have to choose between their Christian faith and making a difference in their neighborhoods,
Wow.
in their local context, in the world. And they're like, I don't know how these two things are reconciled, because they don't see a lot of examples, and they're looking for more examples.
Do you think that's contributing to some measure to the dropout we continue to see in the church?
Absolutely, because especially from kind of racially minoritized communities and younger people, they're saying that the church has nothing for me, because the gospel is so anemic, it's so weak, it's so the gospel that the churches are proclaiming. I believe that the gospel is all powerful.
Yeah.
It's
No, I
beautiful,
hear the nuance. Yeah, I hear
but
the distinction.
but what they're saying is like they're not God is small in the churches that they're attending. That Jesus is like this like kind of ineffectual person that has nothing meaningful to say or nothing meaningful to contribute to the broader world, and they're not happy with that. And so they have that, and then they find that the racial tensions in society are actually greater within the churches, especially if there's more diversity, and if it's primarily white, they really have a hard time with that, because they feel like their dignity is oftentimes questioned, their humanity is oftentimes undermined, and that the unity that God calls us to is not actually being demonstrated and represented. It's more of like a call to uniformity that they hear within the church, and they're like, this just doesn't seem like, like the Jesus that we see in the Bible in Acts 2, where all these people are coming together from all these different communities, or how in all the book of Acts there's this constant movement outwards, where people are being drawn in, and implicit biases are being challenged, where Cornelius's presence and entry into the ministry, into the family of God, challenges Peter, and Lydia's entry into the family of God challenges Paul. And then the conversations at the Areopagus, are like where people are actually, where the apostles are actually looking at what's happening in the world and saying, this is how the gospel applies to this, instead of just saying, oh, you don't have to talk about that, none of that matters. You don't have to, you can just ignore that and just kind of preach the gospel without taking context into consideration. And so students are asking that all the time, and they're finding the church wanting.
Well, that might be a very good place to leave this, because it's clear that so much is changing. Ray, thank you so much. And hey, leaders, Ray, along with many others, are among the contributors to Barna's upcoming release, Beyond Diversity. So you can go to barna.com/Beyond Diversity to pre-order this new report. Comes out at the end of April, depending on when you're listening to this. And because we love you, leaders, use the promo code ChurchPulse15, ChurchPulse15 for a discount. And thanks also to MetaShare. They're making sure that these episodes get into your AirPods on a regular basis. They are an affordable Christian alternative to health insurance. So whether you want that as an individual or you're looking to equip your team, go to metashare.com/ChurchPulse to see how much you could be saving on health insurance. Let me try that again. See how much you could be saving on health insurance by switching to their services. So, Ray, thanks again for being with us.